51. I'll tell you what, we're going to read through this. We're not going to cover it all today, but as we cover it, you just ought to be able to feel the crushing weight of sin on David. We'll get through it some way or another. But let's look at 2 Samuel 11. Well, 2 Samuel. Let me just tell you that the heading, we're going to look at that too. The heading to Psalm 51 says this: for the director of music, a psalm of David, when the prophet of Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. So that's what Psalm 51 was written in regard to. When he had committed, it was from the visit of Nathan as a result of David having committed adultery with Bathsheba. So I thought we'd just go over and look at that for just a second. Yeah, it's on. 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. There's some things that have just been made aware to me as I read through here I don't think I've ever seen before, but I don't make a steady diet of reading 2 Samuel 11. The verse 1 says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war. That's the first sentence in that chapter. David sent Joab with the king's men and his whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites in the siege, but David remained in Jerusalem. When all of the kings go off to war, David stayed home. Why? David is the king of all kings, man. He's the king of Israel. They went, he stayed home. While he was there at home, he saw this. He was on his roof and he saw this woman taking a bath. Her name was Bathsheba. She was very beautiful, and he checked her out and ended up having an affair with her, and she got pregnant. Now, Bathsheba was the daughter. This is interesting because why all of a sudden did she just move into the neighborhood? You know, he'd never seen her before. Bathsheba is the daughter of Eliam, who is the son of a man named Ahithophel. That man is in the stuff I read. I did not go check it out, but he is described as David's famous counselor. Now, I've never heard of him, and I'm sure that if we went and checked him out, we would find what he's famous for. But what that meant to me was he lived close because he was an integral part of David's administration. That's why Bathsheba was there. He's the granddaughter of that man, and the families lived together, I guess, and that's why she lived there. I don't know why all of a sudden David saw her. You would think that if she's the granddaughter of his famous counselor, he would have known her before. But I thought that was an interesting thing. So she gets pregnant, and David is saying, "Oh, woe is me! What am I going to do about this?" So he decides he will call her husband back home from the war. Now, his name was Uriah, and he said, "I will have him come home. He will go to his house, and everybody will think that he lay with his wife, and as a result of that visit, she got pregnant. And then all the heat will be off of David," right? Well, the problem is Uriah was a loyal man. He was loyal to David, and he was loyal to his troops, and he wouldn't go home. I don't even think he went home at all, because the indication is that there was no way anybody could question whether he slept with his wife or not. And if he even went just to have a cup of coffee, then he went back to the palace, they'd say, "Well, I know what happened while he was there." I don't think he went at all. He slept at the palace, slept on the doorstep, and never went home. Well, so this puts David in this situation. What do I do now? So what did he do? He said, I'm going to send, he told, I think it was Joab, I don't remember all the names, I'm just telling you from memory. He sent Uriah to the front line where the fighting was the fiercest. That was the instruction given. I want you to take him to the front line where the fighting is the fiercest, knowing that or feeling like he would be killed. That's tantamount to murder, right? He didn't raise the knife, didn't point the gun, but he put him in a situation where he knew he would be killed. So, let me see what I need to tell you. So we've got this plan to cover up. The plan didn't work. Uriah gets killed. And the clincher of this whole story, David feels like he's he made it, unscathed. But I want you to look at chapter 11, verse 27. 2 Samuel 27. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. Here is a kicker. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. What I'm going to tell you, everything that came before, this chapter and the next chapter is the reason Psalm 51 was written. But I'm going to tell you, context is not important to understand Psalm 51. It does not matter that David had an affair with Bathsheba. It does not matter that he killed her husband. From our standpoint, we look at Psalm 51 as if we have a sin that we have to deal with, that we have to repent of. Okay? You don't have to have an affair with somebody and kill the woman's husband or kill the man's wife for Psalm 51 to have application to your life. You just have to have sin in your life that needs to be repented of. Now, what happens in chapter 12 is the judgment, David's judgment. He thinks he's gotten away with it. And what happens in the first 4 verses of chapter 12, Nathan comes to David and he tells him this story. Nathan's a prophet. He tells him this story. Let me read it. He says, when he came to him, he said, there were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, and the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. He shared his food, drank his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. In verse 4, it says, now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the single ewe of this man who had one little sheep, and took him. And verse 5 said David burned with anger because of that. David's, I just get this feeling he's almost put this thing with Bathsheba and Uriah out of his mind as being sin. I mean, he got away with it. So this story, he has not been able to put together in his mind that it applies to him. So he burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. Now that had no pity is the other thing that has to do with us. This thing right here, these verses, doesn't matter that David reacted that way. What matters is that he had no remorse for his sin, just like we have no remorse for ours. Now, Nathan pronounced that he was the man, so he made David aware that he did not get away with it. The consequences began almost immediately. You look at verse 13, 14, and 15. Jump over there to that. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die. See, David pronounced his own judgment. When he burned with anger and said that that man ought to die for what he did, taking the poor, you should die. Nathan, you're not going to die. But look what's going to happen. Because by doing this you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt, the son born to you will die. And then verse 15 says, after Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had born to David, and he became ill and he ultimately died. The consequence of David's sin, once he was aware of it and knew he was caught, the consequence was immediate. Not a bit immediate. Nathan went home and the Lord struck the child. Right after Nathan delivered this pronouncement, we know, God knows, it was immediate. Now that's the background for Psalm 51. And I want you to know, again, that you do not have to have an affair with a woman if you're a man. You do not have to have an affair with a man if you're a woman for this to apply to you. You do not have to murder somebody for Psalm 51 to apply to you. All you have to have is a sin. How many of you got a sin? How many of you have had a sin? Now this is a crushing sin. This was crushing for David. Now, there's lots of sins that we have probably that just kind of pass us by, where you say, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore, or why did I do that? That's not the kind of sin I'm talking about. This thing was crushing for David. I cannot answer that, but I will tell you, sometimes it's a consequence of this, a natural consequence. If you go over to probably Deuteronomy, that's where all this stuff is, where he says, I'm going to pass down the consequences of your sin to the children of the fourth generation. That doesn't mean that God has to do it. It could be a natural consequence. The way I heard this in a sermon, it had to do with drinking. You have a man who is not a heavy drinker. He would just have a drink after work with friends. His family never would even see it. Then his son hears about it with him talking to his wife or the mother. So the son knows the father did it. Then the son grows up, and he knew his father did that, and so he kind of looks like it as an endorsement. So the son goes to happy hour, starts going to happy hour. Then he goes home, kind of stumbling around, and his son sees that he's been drinking. So you see what's happening. It just naturally passes down, and it gets worse as it goes down. That does not mean that God doesn't do that, and the reason he does it, he's got his own purposes. I could never begin to tell you why. But that's the way I understand that thing on the fourth generation. What would it be? Help me with it, Wayne. It said, the sword will never depart from your house. That's in there, and I don't see it just right away, but there it is. Verse 10. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Now, what is I find interesting about that, first of all, the sword is never going to depart from his house. That's pretty clear. But the reason is you showed that you despise me. It's not necessarily that he killed Uriah, but it's because you despised me. You disobeyed my law that is very clear. That means it's a sin against me. And we're going to talk about this. It's not a sin against Uriah. You would say, oh, yes, it is. Well, I don't think it is. We're going to talk about it. But he sinned as a result of despising God. Pretty powerful. Okay, so it was written as a result of David's sin with Bathsheba, and the number of murder of Uriah, not number. It's not the sin itself. The implication was that the judgment for his sin was also given because David had no remorse for it. We talked about that, remember? He had no remorse for it. Thought he got away with it. So for us, the application of Psalm 51 is not based on us having a humongous sexual affair and commit murder. It's about the realization of sin in our life and repenting for it. This is why I say context is not important in the lament psalms. I'm probably going to say that every time we study one because it's important to remember that. Because you see, all the stuff talks about it applied to David. It's not that it applies to David, it applies to us. We're told these things because this is what God expects of us, not because of what David did. You can't even say, well, David's my example. I don't want you to have an example of a man that has an affair with another woman and murders her husband. I don't want that man to be my example. What I want is what God says about it and what he expects us to have. Okay, the outline got 6 parts to it. We're going to go through verse 9 today. Verse 1 and 2 is a plea for forgiveness. Verse 3 through 6 is a confession of sin. 7 through 9 is a plea for cleansing from sin. 10 through 12 is a plea for restoration. 13 through 17 is a vow of praise and contrition. And 18 and 19 is an expanded plea for restoration of Zion, which is kind of a different thing. So we'll start with verse 1 and 2, plea for forgiveness. So let me read that. Verse 1 and 2. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your, see, that was the one in that Psalm 13, unfailing love. According to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. All right, that's verse 2. It's a plea for forgiveness. The cry is for mercy. Mercy is something we desire that we do not deserve. We get it from God at the option of God. Right? Does he have to give it, or does he have to give it? We're going to talk about that. Mercy is requested from a person who has the power to grant it. If you needed mercy from Wayne for something, and you ask me for it, it doesn't make much sense. You got to go to the person that has a reason to grant it or not, or to withhold it. In this case, David requests mercy from God. God, G-O-D, capital G, little o-D, is Elohim. That's the all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient God. He is well qualified to grant mercy. He's powerful enough. So if he's going to God for mercy, that must mean that he feels his sin is against God, right? He wouldn't go to Bathsheba's father, to ask, or Bathsheba to ask for mercy. He goes to the person that needs to grant the mercy, and that is God. That's why he called his name. He calls for God to grant mercy according to his unfailing love. Now, back in Psalm 31:3, we had a phrase we encountered called, "For the sake of his name." Do you remember that? David was asking for guidance. For the sake of your name, you need to give me guidance. And I told you that God was bound by his attributes to give guidance. He was calling on him to do that. In that case, I need to expand on that for completeness. For the sake of his name, he is bound to give guidance based on a prior commitment to that person. Okay, so he's not bound in all cases to give guidance. He's bound in all cases to give guidance to those people he has a commitment with. You see what I'm saying? David had a commitment with God, so God is bound to give him guidance for the sake of his name. But if you have some pagan king off somewhere asking God to give him guidance, well, God has no commitment with this guy. This guy doesn't believe in God. He believes in some other stick of wood that they call God. So God's not bound to give him guidance unless he so chooses. He's bound to give his people guidance, all right, for the sake of his name. In this case, we're not talking about the phrase "for the sake of his name" specifically, but it's implied because unfailing love is an attribute of God. He asked for mercy according to your unfailing love. So I think that God is bound, even though it doesn't say "for the sake of his name," I think it's implied because David calls on him for mercy according to his unfailing love. Because of your unfailing love, please grant me mercy. And I think God's bound to do it. I think you could just pencil in "for the sake of his name," and it would have the same effect. So my question is, I already covered all that. So my question is, with no answer needed, it says, within God's attribute of unfailing love, is he bound to grant mercy to David? I say yes, because he has a prior commitment to David. Do y'all understand what I'm saying? To an unsaved person, God doesn't have the same, he's not bound by the same things for that person that he is bound to with me. I have experience with him. I have faith in him. I've accepted him. I'm not a perfect person. He knows I love him. He knows I've made that commitment, and he has that commitment with me. So there's certain things he's bound to do for me. Maybe not when I want it and how I want it, but he's bound to do it because of his defined attributes. But for somebody that doesn't trust him, doesn't know him, doesn't care about him, he's not bound to do the same things for that guy that he is for me. Okay. So he said, I love this. It's not in the NIV, but it is in the King James. He calls on him according to your unfailing love and according to your great compassion. The King James says, multitudes of tender mercies. Oh, according to the multitudes of your tender mercies. He called on him for that. And on the basis of his unfailing love, show me mercy. Now, what is he expecting? What is he expecting when he asks for mercy? Look at that verse 2. Or it starts at the end of verse 1. Blot out my transgressions, wash away my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. When he asks for mercy, wants God to just turn his head the other way. Act like it never happened. we don't need to discuss blot, wash, and cleanse necessarily. They have to do with ritual activities in Judaism, but you know what they mean. Blot, wash, and cleanse. They're purification processes. This is a record so foul that it takes a multitude of tender mercies to get the job of blotting, washing, and cleansing done. There's nobody like Charles Spurgeon. He said that. Unless God so chooses, he will do nothing about the consequences. When you kill a person as a Christian, you get drunk and come home and just beat your wife to death and get thrown in jail as a result of it, you're going to serve the full term. If you get, he can change the consequences if he so chooses. He will forgive you. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. He will forgive you of it, but he doesn't necessarily change the consequences.
What? The sword will never depart from your house because you despise me. It sounds like that is God saying, well, you're in trouble for that long. But is this just talking about the consequences?
It doesn't mean that God caused that, because one of the examples we talked about was Absalom. Absalom.
That was a result of his action.
Yeah, Absalom. I'm sure, there are no secrets in the kingdom. The whole kingdom is going to know David had an affair with Bathsheba. They're all going to know that he sent her husband off to war into a situation where he's going to be killed. They're going to look, this is a big deal. This is our king who is supposed to be chosen by God. To be king of Israel was a spiritual office too, not just something that you just are elected to. It's a spiritual thing. So he has a standard he has to live up to beyond just being a civil leader. He's got spiritual requirements too. And so they see all this other stuff. Absalom grows up in his house knowing how his father was, how David lived his life, and it affected him. And he ended up also being, he took over David's kingdom. David had to leave, had fear for his life. Absalom gets hung up in a tree. Remember that? The Baptist of the campus with the long, I'm sure his hair wasn't blonde, but I see him with blonde hair. Long, probably special clothes. Hung it up in a tree with his long hair, and they speared him, shot him with arrows a bunch of times. So some of that stuff is just a natural consequence of a dysfunctional family. I think, what David should have done, I don't know that he didn't. He should have gotten down on his knees with Bathsheba, with all of their children. Solomon is one of their children, and all of his other wives, whoever he's having kids probably with everybody. He needs to get down on his knees with all of them. He needs to put them in a position where their eyes are turned towards God so that they can make their own decisions, not live under the shadow of the dysfunction of David and their mother, whoever their mother happened to be. But let God get into the situation, and then some of that could change. But the natural consequence is going to be for the sword to never leave his house. Pitiful, terrible, awful. Okay, so the record includes everything from seemingly minor infractions to major accidental sin, which comes with liability for sin, and high-handed, blatant, habitual sin called iniquity. John Phillips called it a foul record. Foul. He uses the word filthy a lot too in his commentary. The consequences of the sin may be painful to bear, but God will deal gently with our forgiveness through his multitude of tender mercies. The consequence, y'all can't see that. The consequence, I've got an arrow drawn to painful. Consequences of sin are always painful. Otherwise, why not sin? All right? Forgiveness is always gentle. and it comes through God's multitude of tender mercies. I cry listening to that. It may take a lot to get over, to accept I'm forgiven, but in God's way, He intends for it to be gentle. What good would it do? When I disciplined my kids, I was not always gentle. But I'll tell you, when God forgives my sin, it is always gentle. And it is always done. I love that tender mercies. It is always done with His multitude. It takes a multitude of tender mercies to forgive our sin. We sin a lot. It is always done gently, even though it may take a while to get over it. All right, verse 3 through 6 is the confession of sin. Let me read that. 3 through 6. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak and justified when you judge. Surely I have been a sinner from birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Surely you desire truth in the inner parts. You teach me wisdom in the inmost place. There's two things that I cannot escape: my transgressions. I know what they are. There is no doubt. I have full knowledge of them. Therefore, there's, like what you said just a minute ago, Wayne, there is no appeal against justice. I know what they are. I know we're going to see that I know that you were there when I sinned, so I have no appeal. No basis for appeal. They are ever before me. The NIV says always before me. It is never out of my mind. He has an awakened conscience, and he has intense and personal and permanent pain because of his sin, which he can now confess. He is crushed by it. He's now to the point where he says, I know what it is. I know you know what it is. Now he's to the point where he can confess it. Verse 4a says, against you only. Now this is interesting. I learned something right here. I learn something all the time, but I really learned something big here. He says, against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Listen to this. What an evaluation of sin. What about Bathsheba? What about Uriah? What about the baby? Don't forget him. What about the baby born to him? What about the people? Who said the people? You were talking about the people. What about the people of the kingdom? He sinned against. Did he sin against them? I say no, he didn't. The Bible says he didn't. He said, I have only sinned against God. Sin is defined to be, y'all can disagree with me. I'm totally open to anything you want to throw at me, anything you want to say, any kind of disagreement on any level. Sin is defined to be an immoral act considered to be a transgression against divine law. Divine law. If you break a criminal law, to whom do you owe restitution? The state. They don't say you committed a crime against the guy you killed. A sin against the guy you killed. So you broke our law, the law of the state. If you murder someone, I don't think y'all are murderers in here. You probably don't run any chance of becoming one, but that's just the example I came across or thought of. If you murder someone, his family experiences pain, right? We know cases this week about the hit and run guy. You know, the guy hit and ran over the guy at the bus stop. His pain, his wife, his family is in a lot of pain. They don't know who did it. But anyway, his family experiences pain as a result of your act, for your act is considered an act against the state. They don't punish you because you committed an act against his family. They punish you because you broke our state law, our federal law, our county law, okay? So I think if you look at it from that standpoint, his sin is only against God because he broke divine law. Do you understand that? Does that make sense? That doesn't mean there's not moral issues. Yeah, that's right. It's not a sin against Bathsheba. It's not a sin against Uriah. Those are sins against divine law. Now, y'all can disagree with that. It doesn't matter to me. But the Bible says, I've only sinned against you, so you got to deal with that too. What? Against God. Against God. Would like to say, well, that can't be right. I don't believe that. The Bible's pretty clear about it. And why is it taken to be age 72 before I can understand that? Because I would say, I'm sure I said in the past, well, what about Bathsheba? What about her husband? Those are moral issues. There's nothing moral about having an affair. There's nothing moral about killing someone. But the sin is against God. Pretty clear. Oh, yeah. Oh, he absolutely wronged him. But the sin is against God. Now, I don't know where I am in my notes. David's sorrow and repentance were deep and real. Actually, the truth of the matter is they are crushing for him. There is no victimless crime, and there is no victimless sin. The reality of the pain which was caused as a result of the consequences of his sin was actually sin against God. You've got the sin against God, and that's what you're forgiven of, the sin against God. But there's consequences that flow on. The family of Uriah, the family of Bathsheba, they're all in a world of pain. And there's a certain amount of time it takes for that to get healed. It's never healed. I guess they just get over it. Hard to live with it. But there's another thing, and it's the last part of verse 4. It says, or 4 says, against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Now I thought, well, yeah, that's obvious. But think of it this way. Only the child of God cares what the eyes of God saw. Now that is one powerful statement that I read. Only the child of God cares what God saw. Do you understand that? If you are not a saved person, do you care anything about God? Do you think that he really saw what you did? No, and if he did, I don't care. All I know is I wanted to have an affair, so that's what I did. Yeah, it's painful, but big deal. Everybody gets over it. That's the attitude. But the child of God cares what the eyes of God saw. Uh, because of our, let's see, what I said here was, what we must remember is that when our sin was committed, God was present and he saw it all. Now that is something we don't really think about. You know, if you realized and really believed, you know, we say God sees everything, he knows everything. If you really believed that, could you believe that there is an angel sitting right next to you at the time you commit a sin? Would you commit the sin? Would you? If you knew. You know, we say God, you know, probably nobody in here would argue with it. We think God sees everything, knows it before we do it and all that stuff. But what if you really thought there was an angel sitting right next to you when you committed a sin? Would you commit it? God, it's going to be thrown up to you someday, whether you believe it or not. But that's what we're talking about here. He says, done what is evil in your sight. So, because of our, okay, the last part of 4C, was that? There isn't a 4C. Yeah, there is. So that you are proved right when you speak and justified when you judge. That's God we're talking about here. Because of our confession and the witness of the judge himself, that's God, he saw it, the transgression is placed beyond debate. David knows he sinned. He knows God saw it. And he knows he's a righteous judge. So he's got no argument. Nobody to argue with. I got to own up to it. All right, verse 5 says, again, I'll read it. Surely I have been a sinner from birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. That's not really true. The source of sin is in our souls, not in our surroundings. Soul. The soul, remember that? The nephesh we talked about is what you became when God breathed the breath of life into you. You became a living being. That's your soul. That's where the sin is. The source of sin is not in our surroundings. David was not saying he had no choice because he was born with it. I want you to think about that. Born with it. It's like Skip Wilson. I don't know if you remember him. He used to say the devil made me do it. You know, David was not saying he had no choice because he was born with it. He was saying he was born in sin, but he was also saying he has a choice. So if anybody ever tells you they're living the kind of life that they're living because they were born that way, they always have a choice, no matter what it is. He was not blaming his mother. But the knowledge, he was not blaming his mother, but to acknowledge the deep taproots of sin. He was not trying to justify himself. He was completing his confession. That's what this is about. Verse 6 says, surely you desire truth in the inner parts. You teach me wisdom in the inmost place. The object is for the outward virtue, the inward purity to match the outward virtue. Our inside needs to look like what we want people to see on the outside. Usually not. Let the inside look like the outside, or let the outside look like the inside. I'm not sure which way I intended for it to be. Let the real heart within match the outward actions people see. How does this happen? How does that happen? how does our inside and our outside get in reconciliation with each other? It happens through teaching from God, which comes through His Word. I knew there was a reason we talked about Psalm 119 the other day. I knew there was. Our verse of the week one week was Psalm 119, 102. Let me read that to you. You can find it, Psalm 119, 102. It's here. 119, 102. I have not departed from your laws, for you yourself have taught me. That teaching comes through the Word. And the study of the Word causes revelation. You said this was a convicting lesson when we talked about that. To read the Bible, I mean, you can get revelation from God at any time. He can give it to you when you're driving down the road, when you're walking through the woods, when you're doing just about anything. You can get revelation from God. But it more readily flows if you study His Word. You can be taught by God. Look at Psalm 119, 104. It says, I gain understanding from your precepts, therefore I hate every wrong path. Look at 105. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Powerful. You get that from the study of the Word. That's how God teaches you, as you get into His Word. With the right lamp, we don't get off the path. This is how the inward purity comes to match the outward virtue.